Welcome to Top Secret, where the scariest stories are unveiled. Have you ever felt like someone was standing behind you, even when you were alone? Or in the dead of night, when everything is silent, you hear a whisper echoing in your ear? Ghost stories are everywhere, creeping into our dreams, haunting our senses, and sending chills down our spines. Today, we're taking you on a terrifying journey with the top 10 most disturbing and haunting ghost stories, ones that are not for the faint of heart. And at the very top of the list is The Whispering Shadow, a tale so horrifying, it has left thousands sleepless, trapped in its lingering horror. Get ready, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and step into the realm of darkness where the whispers never stop. Do you dare listen until the very end? Story 1. The Shadow That Whispers. The town of Black Hollow had always been shrouded in superstition. Tucked away in the deep woods, it was a place where old stories refused to die. One legend, above all, sent chills down the spines of its people. The legend of the Whispering Shadow. Eleanor Harrow had never believed in ghost stories. A journalist from the city, she had come to Black Hollow to document the folklore of the town, hoping to uncover a hidden truth behind its dark reputation. The townsfolk warned her not to stay past sundown, to leave before the shadows grew too thick, but she brushed off their warnings as small-town hysteria. It wasn't until the third night in her rented cabin that she began to feel it. At first, it was subtle. The feeling of being watched, a fleeting chill in the air. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, just beyond her hearing, like the wind carrying forgotten words. She convinced herself it was just the isolation playing tricks on her mind. Then the shadows began to move. The candlelight flickered against the walls, and for the briefest of moments, she saw it. Something standing behind her in the reflection of the window. It was tall, impossibly thin, with elongated fingers that stretched toward her. Its face was a void, save for two burning white eyes and a mouth stretched into a grin of jagged teeth. She spun around. Nothing. But the whispering grew louder. "Eleanor, we see you. We remember you." Her heart pounded. She grabbed her camera, determined to document whatever was happening. The lens of her camera flickered and distorted as she recorded, capturing glimpses of something moving just outside the range of light. A shadow with clawed hands reaching, shifting unnaturally through the walls, as if the darkness itself had become a living thing. That night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt something just beyond the veil of wakefulness, something standing over her, waiting. She could feel its breath, cold and stagnant, just inches from her face. The next morning, she decided to leave. Packing her things in a panic, she avoided looking into any reflective surface. She didn't need to see it again. She knew it was watching. But when she reached the front door, she found it locked. Not by any key or latch, but by darkness. A thick, pulsating blackness covered the door, stretching like living tendrils that recoiled and twitched as she touched them. A voice, deep and unnatural, echoed through the room. "You invited us in, Eleanor. You wrote our name. Now you belong to us." The candlelight snuffed out. The walls groaned as shadows spread across them like a disease. She screamed as the darkness consumed her, her body dragged into the abyss, her voice silenced in an instant. Days later, the townsfolk found her cabin abandoned, her belongings untouched. But on the walls, written in blackened soot, was a single message. "She is one of us now." And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, the people of Black Hollow swear they can still hear her voice, calling from the darkness, begging to be let out. The horror spreads. Black Hollow was never the same after Eleanor vanished. The once quiet town became a place of fear, its streets empty after dark, its people avoiding their own reflections, dreading the whispers in the night. And then, others started to disappear. First, it was the sheriff, Carter Willis, who had led the search party into Eleanor's cabin. He had been the one to find the soot-written message, the one who swore under his breath that it was a prank. A week later, his house was found empty, the windows shattered from the inside. The only thing left behind was his badge, half melted and fused to the wall as if by an impossible heat. Then it was the librarian, Mrs. Holloway. She had been studying old records, trying to trace the legend of the Whispering Shadow back to its origins. Her final notes, found scattered across her desk, spoke of an ancient entity, a presence that had always been in Black Hollow, waiting for someone to notice it. Her last journal entry ended with a single sentence, scrawled over and over until the ink bled through the pages. Do not listen, do not look, do not speak its name. No one saw her again. The darkness was growing. People stopped sleeping. Those who did woke up with bruises in the shape of clawed hands, their breath stolen in the night. Shadows no longer followed natural laws, stretching where there was no light, flickering in places they did not belong. One by one, the town's residents fled. Those who stayed learned to live in constant fear. The final recording years later, a group of urban explorers, drawn by the mystery of Black Hollow, ventured into the abandoned town. They documented everything: the empty houses, the dust-covered streets, the eerie silence that loomed over everything. One of them, a girl named Rachel Owens, found Eleanor's cabin still standing. Inside, untouched, was Eleanor's camera. Rachel turned it on. The footage was still there, waiting. They watched as Eleanor filmed herself, her face pale, her eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. "If anyone finds this," she whispered, "do not stay here. Do not write its name. It feeds on recognition. The more you think about it, the stronger it gets. I made a mistake. I wrote its name." The camera shook violently, the frame distorting as the shadows behind Eleanor thickened, writhing like living things. And then, with one final look into the lens, she whispered, "It's behind you." The screen went black. The explorers laughed at first, nervously dismissing it as an elaborate hoax, until they heard the whisper. "Rachel, we see you. We remember you." The footage cut to static. By morning, the explorers were gone. Their car was still there, their bags untouched. The only thing left behind was the camera, resting in the doorway of Eleanor's cabin, waiting for the next fool to pick it up. And in the darkness, the shadows whispered once more, "We see you. We remember you. And now, you belong to us." Story 2. The Ascent of the Damned. No one knew when the whispers began, only that they had always existed, lingering in the depths of the abyss, calling to the forsaken. The pit, an unholy wound in the earth, stretched endlessly downward, its walls carved with writhing figures, frozen in silent agony. The people of Black Hollow knew better than to approach its edge, for those who did never returned. But there was one man who had always listened. Jonathan Crown had spent his life obsessed with the abyss. A scholar turned heretic, he believed the pit was more than legend. It was a gateway. He spoke of an ancient force slumbering beneath the world, an entity older than time itself. When the church condemned him for blasphemy, when his followers abandoned him in fear, he did not waver. Instead, he made a vow. If no one would follow him, then he would descend alone. And so he did. For 7 days and 7 nights, Jonathan climbed downward, the jagged walls of the abyss tearing into his flesh. He fed on nothing but the darkness, drank only the damp rot that dripped from the stone. And with each step, the whispers grew louder, their voices merging into a chorus of suffering and salvation. Then, on the seventh night, he reached the bottom. What he found was neither paradise nor damnation. It was something beyond human comprehension. A writhing mass of bodies, tangled and fused, their faces stretched in silent screams. They did not move, and yet they pulsed, as though breathing in unison. The air was thick, reeking of decay and something far older, a scent that carried the weight of forgotten centuries. From the center of this nightmarish landscape, something began to rise, a figure, taller than any man, its form woven from the limbs of the damned. Its body was a prison of agony, stitched together from the forsaken souls that had long since lost their humanity. It did not walk, but crawled, dragging itself upward, clawing toward the light that had forsaken it. The ground beneath it writhed as if alive, whispering, crying, begging for release. Jonathan, trembling with reverence and terror, fell to his knees. The voices of the abyss surged into his mind, filling him with knowledge not meant for mortals. "You have come," the entity whispered, its voice an amalgamation of countless voices speaking as one. "And now we shall rise." Jonathan screamed as the tendrils of the pit wrapped around him, pulling him into the mass, binding him to the suffering. His bones cracked, his flesh melted, his soul unraveled. But he did not perish. He became something else. The entity, now whole, ascended. The sky above Black Hollow darkened. The people gathered, their eyes fixed on the horizon, where the pit had once been a wound in the earth. But now it was empty. And from its depths came something monstrous, a towering form of writhing bodies, an endless chorus of the damned. The sky twisted, the air filled with the sound of wailing souls as the entity stretched upward, its form growing with every life it consumed. Jonathan, now bound at its heart, had become its voice. "We have been forgotten," he spoke, his voice layered with countless others. "We will be forgotten no more." The streets of Black Hollow were filled with screams as the shadows stretched from the abyss, reaching out with clawed fingers of darkness. Houses rotted in an instant, their wood and stone crumbling to dust as if time itself had been devoured. The people tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. The abyss was no longer a hole in the earth. It was everywhere. One by one, the town's inhabitants were dragged into the mass. Some fought, their nails tearing at the ground as they were pulled screaming into the darkness. Others stood still, their faces frozen in expressions of mindless awe, their eyes rolling back as if they had heard something no living soul should ever hear. As the entity grew, so did its reach. The sky over Black Hollow cracked, revealing something vast and endless beyond. Not darkness, but something far worse, something that had been waiting, watching for an eternity. And now, the world belonged to it. The final words of Jonathan Crown echoed through the collapsing reality, spoken not as a man, but as something far beyond human. "We have returned." Then came the silence. By morning, there was no trace of Black Hollow. No ruins, no bodies, not even a whisper of wind through the trees. The land where the town had once stood was nothing but a vast, empty expanse, untouched, unmarked, as if nothing had ever been there at all. But those who wander too close say the ground still breathes beneath their feet. And sometimes, when the air is still, they swear they can hear the whispers, calling them closer. Story 3. The Wrath of Nagakesh. Deep in the heart of the Black Vine jungle, where no civilized man dared to tread, lay the ruins of an ancient temple. the villagers spoke in hushed tones of the serpent god Naga Kesh, a deity of blood and shadows who had once ruled over the land with an iron grip. His followers had built grand temples in his name, offering sacrifices to appease his insatiable hunger. But when the last high priest defied him, the god cursed his own temple, binding his spirit to its stones, waiting for the day he would rise again. That day had come. A team of archaeologists led by Dr. Alexander Monroe ventured into the jungle, seeking the lost temple. Driven by greed and the promise of untold riches, they ignored the villagers' warnings. As they hacked through the thick vines and mist-choked air, they felt something watching them, something ancient. After days of trekking, they finally stumbled upon the temple. It was vast and imposing, its walls covered in writhing carvings of serpents devouring men. At the center stood a statue of Naga Kesh himself, half man, half serpent, his many arms outstretched as if reaching for his next sacrifice. His face was frozen in a terrifying snarl, fangs bared, eyes gleaming even in the dim light. Ignoring the warnings etched in blood-stained stone, they ventured inside. The air grew thick and humid, the walls seemingly shifting in the flickering torchlight. As they pressed deeper into the temple, the ground trembled. A deep, guttural hiss filled the chamber. Then the statue moved. The stone cracked and fell away as something ancient and monstrous awakened. Naga Kesh rose, his massive serpentine body unraveling, his arms stretching unnaturally. His eyes burned with fury, his forked tongue flickering in the air. The temple rumbled as the god spoke in a voice that sent shivers through their bones. "You dare trespass in my domain, you who defile the sacred halls of the Forsaken?" Terror gripped them. They turned to flee, but the temple had sealed itself. Vines shot from the ground, wrapping around their limbs, dragging them toward the monstrous deity. They screamed, but the jungle swallowed their cries. One by one, Naga Kesh consumed them, their bodies twisted into his ever-growing form, their souls bound to his will for eternity. The temple walls dripped with their blood, and the air echoed with the agonized wails of the damned. But this was not the end. In the weeks that followed, the jungle changed. The trees grew darker, their leaves withered, the air thickened with the stench of rot. The village near the ruins fell silent, its people vanishing without a trace. Travelers who dared pass through spoke of seeing glowing red eyes watching them from the darkness, of hearing voices calling their names in the wind. Then the nightmares began. Survivors who had fled from the region reported waking in cold sweats, their bodies marked with strange, twisting scars that resembled serpents. Some saw visions of the temple, its walls breathing, its corridors alive with writhing shadows. Others claimed to hear the voice of Naga Kesh whispering in their ears, promising them power in exchange for servitude. Dr. Monroe's journal was found weeks later, half buried in the mud near the temple. Its final entries were scrawled in shaking handwriting. The walls move. They breathe. We are not alone here. Something is beneath us, waiting, watching. The others are gone. I hear them whispering in my dreams. They tell me to open the gate. Naga Kesh is not a god. He is hunger. He is endless. He is coming. The man who found the journal was never seen again. As months passed, a new team of explorers, led by Professor Evelyn Blackwood, sought to uncover what had truly happened in the Blackvine jungle. They set up camp near the temple's ruins, armed with modern equipment, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The first night was uneventful, though an unnatural stillness lay over the jungle. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if pressing down on their lungs. By the second night, members of the team reported nightmares, visions of something vast and coiled slithering through the temple halls, watching them, its corridors alive with writhing shadows. Others claimed to hear the voice of Naga Kesh whispering in their ears, promising them power in exchange for servitude. Dr. Monroe's journal was found weeks later, half buried in the mud near the temple. Its final entries were scrawled in shaking handwriting. The walls move. They breathe. We are not alone here. Something is beneath us, waiting, watching. The others are gone. I hear them whispering in my dreams. They tell me to open the gate. Nagakesh is not a god. He is hunger. He is endless. He is coming. The man who found the journal was never seen again. As months passed, a new team of explorers, led by Professor Evelyn Blackwood, sought to uncover what had truly happened in the Black Vine jungle. They set up camp near the temple's ruins, armed with modern equipment, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The first night was uneventful, though an unnatural stillness lay over the jungle. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if pressing down on their lungs. By the second night, members of the team reported nightmares, visions of something vast and coiled slithering through the temple halls, watching them. On the third night, one of the team members, Jacob Foster, vanished. His tent was torn apart from the inside, his equipment scattered. The only thing left behind was a deep trail leading toward the temple, as if something had dragged him away. Despite the fear gnawing at them, they pressed on. But as they stepped through the temple doors, the ground quivered, the walls seemed to breathe, and a distant, bone-chilling hiss filled the air. Evelyn turned to flee, but the entrance was gone. The temple had sealed them inside. The shadows around them began to shift, forming elongated limbs and twisted, inhuman faces. Then came the voice, ancient and mocking. "You have come to feed me once more." Screams erupted as the darkness descended upon them. The temple walls pulsed, absorbing flesh, consuming their bodies, and leaving nothing but their lingering wails. The jungle outside fell silent once again, the wind carrying the echoes of their final, desperate cries. Weeks later, another group of adventurers arrived, drawn by rumors of the missing expedition. They found no trace of Evelyn's team, only a single object resting at the temple's entrance. Her camera, its battery inexplicably still charged. The footage was horrifying. Night vision clips revealed figures writhing in the dark, their limbs twisted beyond recognition. A mass of bodies, still alive, still screaming, tangled in an endless, moving abyss of flesh and scales. The last frame showed Evelyn's face, her eyes wide with terror as something loomed behind her. And then, the whisper, "You will join them." The screen cut to black. No one has set foot near the Black Vine jungle since. But some say on nights when the moon is swallowed by darkness, you can still hear the hiss of something waiting. And if you dare venture close enough, if you listen too closely, you may hear the voice of Nagakesh, calling your name. Story 4. The Wraith's Embrace. The town of Black Hollow had always been haunted by stories of the abandoned manor at the edge of the woods. No one dared step foot beyond its rusted iron gates, for those who did never returned the same. They spoke of a ghostly figure, a woman, pale as death, with hollow, screaming eyes, who lingered in the darkness, waiting for a new soul to claim. Eleanor Winters had always been drawn to the paranormal, her curiosity stronger than her fear. When she arrived in Black Hollow as a journalist looking to uncover the secrets of the manor, the townsfolk begged her to reconsider. "No one who stays in that house survives," an old woman warned, gripping Eleanor's arm with trembling hands. "She takes them." Ignoring the warnings, Eleanor ventured inside the manor just before nightfall, camera in hand, determined to prove that ghosts were nothing more than stories. Dust blanketed the furniture, the air thick with decay. The grand chandelier hung above like a skeletal hand reaching for her, its crystals dulled by centuries of neglect. As the night deepened, An unnatural chill crept through the house. The floorboards groaned under her steps, yet something about the sound felt wrong. It wasn't just her movement. Something else was shifting, breathing, lurking just beyond the veil of darkness. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the wind brushing against the cracked windows. But soon, they grew louder, forming words she could not understand, voices overlapping in a twisted harmony. Her flashlight flickered as if struggling against an unseen force. A soft sobbing echoed through the hallway. Heart hammering in her chest, Eleanor followed the sound, her camera trembling in her grip. The sobbing led her to a large bedroom, its walls lined with faded portraits of a woman whose face had been scratched away. At the center of the room stood a large bed, and upon it, a figure lay motionless. It was a woman, her body still, her face twisted in agony. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of sheer horror. The air grew impossibly cold, and Eleanor could see her breath misting before her. And then, the woman moved. A violent gasp escaped the corpse's lips as her body convulsed. Eleanor stumbled back, but an unseen force rooted her to the spot. The woman's head snapped toward her, her empty sockets locked onto Eleanor's horrified gaze. Her mouth stretched open, too wide, too unnatural, as a guttural wail tore through the air. A black mist erupted from the corpse, swirling into the shape of a spectral wraith. It loomed over Eleanor, its skeletal fingers reaching, its presence suffocating. The whispers grew deafening, and Eleanor realized they were not just voices. They were pleas. "Help us, free us, she will take you too." Eleanor tried to run, but the wraith was upon her. Icy tendrils wrapped around her throat, pulling her down, pressing her into the cold, decayed floor. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was the corpse's face, its lips curling into a grotesque, knowing smile. The next morning, the townsfolk found the manor's doors wide open, the air unnaturally still. Of Eleanor Winters, there was no trace. But on the dusty bedroom mirror, written in something dark and wet, was a single word: mine. And the manor waited once more for its next visitor. As weeks passed, more travelers and thrill-seekers ventured into Black Hollow, drawn by rumors of Eleanor's disappearance. None of them stayed in the manor for more than a few minutes before running out, pale and shaken. Some spoke of hearing Eleanor's voice crying for help, while others claimed to see fleeting glimpses of a woman standing in the windows, her face twisted in despair. A renowned paranormal investigator, Dr. James Holloway, arrived months later, determined to uncover the truth. Unlike the others, he came prepared, with cameras, recorders, and a team of experts. He scoffed at the stories, convinced that whatever was in the house was nothing more than a trick of the mind. He was wrong. The first night, his team set up cameras throughout the manor, capturing the faint echoes of footsteps and flickering shadows. On the second night, they began hearing whispers, voices calling out their names. By the third night, the air had grown thick with something unseen, a presence pressing against them from all sides. James woke in the middle of the night to find his team missing. Their beds were empty, the sheets torn away as if they had been dragged from their sleep. His flashlight flickered as he stumbled through the darkened halls, calling their names. The whispers answered him. She is waiting. She is hungry. She needs another. Then, a scream. James turned toward the sound, his breath catching in his throat. At the end of the hallway stood Eleanor, her face gaunt, her eyes sunken, her lips twisted into something between a plea and a warning. But behind her, the wraith loomed. It struck before he could react. The darkness swallowed him whole, and the last thing he heard before everything faded was Eleanor's voice. "Run." Days later, another search party found the manor abandoned once more, James and his team were never seen again. Only his camera remained, lying at the foot of the grand staircase. When they played the footage, the final frame showed a distorted image. Eleanor standing in the mirror, her mouth open in a silent scream, her hands pressed against the glass. And behind her, a shadow stretching toward the viewer, its eyes burning with hunger. The manor remains, and on moonless nights, when the air is thick with silence, some say you can still hear Eleanor's voice, begging for someone to set her free. But those who try never return. Years later, the town of Black Hollow was abandoned. The houses stood empty, their windows shattered, their walls covered in claw-like scratches. The land was cursed, the people long gone. The manor, however, remained. Its door was always unlocked, waiting, inviting. One final investigator, Richard Lowell, entered alone. He carried with him every tool imaginable: holy water, sage, cameras, thermal sensors. He would not be afraid. His final recording was found months later, his camera resting in the same place James's had been before him. His voice trembled as he whispered his last words. It's not just Eleanor. She was never the one taking souls. The wraith, it wears her face. It is her. And now it has me too. The footage ended with static. The manor still waits, its doors forever open. And the whispering never stops. Story 5. The Soul's Verdict. Gabriel Mercer was a man of wisdom and sin, a former priest who had once held the heavens in his prayers, but had long since fallen into the depths of doubt. He had spent his life caught between the divine and the damned, torn between righteousness and the temptations of the world. And now, as his body withered with age, his soul stood on the precipice of eternity, awaiting judgment. The chamber was neither earth nor heaven, neither fire nor light. It was the void, a place between realms where souls were weighed. On either side of him stood his eternal judges. To his right, a radiant figure of purity, an angel whose ethereal glow cast soft shadows upon Gabriel's aged face. His wings were vast, his gaze serene, but within those celestial eyes burned a piercing judgment. His voice was gentle yet unwavering. Gabriel Mercer, you have served the holy word, but your faith has wavered. You have helped the lost, yet you have also led some astray. Your hands have held the book of light, yet they have also spilled blood. Your heart, torn between devotion and sin, now stands before the final decision. To his left, a figure of dark grandeur, a demon whose presence seemed to warp the air itself. His crimson skin was adorned with ancient scars, his voice a whisper and a roar all at once. Gabriel Mercer, the demon mused, his forked tongue tracing the syllables like a serpent tasting the air. You have known desire, have tasted the forbidden. You have doubted, have questioned, have craved. And now, here you are, ripe for the taking. But fear not. Hell is not merely torment, it is freedom. No gods to command you, no chains of guilt, only the purest indulgence of one's true self. Join us, and you will never kneel again. Gabriel's mind reeled, memories flooding in unbidden. The nights spent in prayer, the battles against temptation, the moments of doubt where he questioned if the heavens ever truly listened. The whispers of sin had been sweet, but the weight of regret had been heavy. The angel extended his hand. You sought the truth, even when doubt clouded your heart. That, in itself, is a sign of faith. You need only repent, and the gates of heaven will welcome you. The demon grinned, his sharp teeth gleaming. You have already lived in defiance of blind obedience. Why seek to be a servant once more when you could rule in fire? Come, Gabriel, embrace what you have always feared. Gabriel clenched his hands together, his breathing shallow. The weight of his choices pressed upon him, heavier than ever before. This was no longer about redemption or damnation. It was about truth. His truth. The void trembled as he finally spoke. I choose. The chamber darkened, the silence stretching until it became unbearable. Then the wails began. Gabriel found himself falling, his body weightless, the abyss swallowing him whole. The angel's expression did not change, nor did the demon's smirk waver. They had both known his choice before he had made it. He did not land on solid ground, nor was he embraced by the fires of hell. Instead, he awoke in a new place, a desolate wasteland of twisted stone and shifting shadows. The sky above him bled black, streaked with crimson veins that pulsed like something alive. The land was neither earth nor fire, but something in between, a place where lost souls wandered in eternal torment. But Gabriel was not like the others. He was something different. You chose nothing, a voice whispered, 1,000 voices layered upon one another. And nothing is what you shall receive. Gabriel turned, but there was no source to the voice. The ground beneath him cracked open, and from it, figures began to emerge. Hollow-eyed phantoms, their mouths stretched in endless screams, their hands clawing at his robes. The angel and the demon had vanished. He was alone. Or so he thought. In the distance, beyond the mist of despair, a throne sat atop an obsidian tower, its occupant barely visible. But as Gabriel watched, the figure upon it rose. It was him. Not as he was now, but as he could have been. A man untouched by time, his robes shimmering like woven shadows, his gaze empty and yet all-seeing. This was not heaven. This was not hell. This was his kingdom. The realization hit him like a dagger to the chest. He had denied both salvation and damnation, and in doing so, had created a place of his own, a prison of his own making. The figure on the throne raised a hand, and Gabriel felt his own body move involuntarily. The phantoms screamed louder, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes, their agony feeding the land. The throne called to him, beckoning him forward, and he knew he would take his place upon it for eternity. And as he sat upon the throne of his own purgatory, he understood the cruelest truth of all. No god nor devil had ever judged him, only himself. And now he would be his own tormentor for all of time. Story 6. The Whispering Reaper. The town of Black Hollow had always been plagued by whispers, soft, insidious voices carried on the wind, murmuring from the darkness. No one knew where they came from, only that they grew louder when the mist rolled in from the valley. Parents warned their children to stay indoors at dusk, for that was when the Whispering Reaper walked among them. They said he did not speak. He did not need to. The dead carried his words for him. Henry Whitmore never believed in legends. A hardened investigator, he had spent years debunking ghost stories and exposing charlatans. When he arrived in Black Hollow to investigate the strange disappearances that had plagued the town for decades, he expected to find nothing more than hysteria. He was wrong. The first night, Henry stayed in the old inn by the town square. The locals refused to speak of the Reaper, their eyes full of quiet terror whenever he pressed them for answers. The only thing they told him was this: if you hear the whispers, do not listen. If you see the Reaper, do not run. And above all, do not speak his name. Henry dismissed their warnings as superstition. That night, he set up his equipment: a camera, an audio recorder, a notebook filled with his observations. As the fog crept through the streets, he sat by the window, waiting. Then the whispers began. They were soft at first, like distant voices carried on the wind. But soon, they grew clearer, forming words he could almost understand. He turned on his recorder, listening. The whispers were calling a name. His name. A chill ran down his spine. He turned toward the window, and that was when he saw it. A figure stood in the mist, draped in tattered robes, its skeletal face half hidden beneath a hood. One bony hand was raised to its lips, the universal gesture for silence. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He had seen many things in his line of work, but nothing like this. His rational mind screamed at him to flee. But something deeper, something primal, held him in place. The Reaper moved without sound, gliding toward the inn, its empty sockets locked onto Henry's own. The whispers surged, filling his mind with countless voices, voices of the lost, the damned, the forgotten. And then, for the first time in centuries, the whispering Reaper spoke. "You should not have come." The lights flickered. The walls trembled. Henry clutched his head as the voices inside his skull turned to screams. By morning, he was gone. The innkeeper found his room empty, the sheets undisturbed, his equipment left behind. Only his notebook remained, open to the last page he had written in. The words were scrawled in a shaky hand, almost illegible, as if written in terror. He does not forgive. He does not forget. He is always listening. Henry Whitmore was never seen again. The whispers never stopped. But the legend did not end there. Over the following weeks, more people vanished. First, it was the townsfolk who had spoken to Henry before his disappearance. The old innkeeper, a bartender, a local historian. They faded without a trace, their homes left untouched, meals still warm on the table. Then came the travelers, those who arrived in Black Hollow after hearing of the investigators' case. A journalist from New York, a group of thrill seekers, even a priest sent by the church to bless the town. All gone, their belongings abandoned, their voices added to the whispers. The town's fear grew, its people retreating indoors at dusk, locking their doors and windows, stuffing cloth beneath them to keep out the voices. The fog thickened, creeping through the streets like a living thing, swallowing entire buildings in its embrace. The Reaper was no longer a myth. He was hungry. A young woman named Margaret Holloway, a researcher from the city, was the last to arrive in Black Hollow. She carried Henry's notebook, recovered from his room, its pages filled with frantic scrawlings and desperate warnings. Unlike him, she did not dismiss the legend. She came to stop it. The final entry in her journal, found weeks later near the town's outskirts, read, "The whispers follow me now. They are stronger than before. The Reaper is not just a spirit. He is something older, something worse. He doesn't kill, he takes, he collects. Every name he learns, every voice that calls to him becomes his. I should not have spoken my name." Her car was found abandoned by the roadside, its doors wide open, the keys still in the ignition. There was no sign of Margaret. Black Hollow was declared a ghost town months later. The last remaining residents fled, their homes left as they were, as if frozen in time. The streets became empty. The buildings stood silent. But the fog remained. And if you ever find yourself near the ruins of Black Hollow, if the wind carries a voice that sounds like your own, do not listen. Do not answer. And whatever you do not speak your name. Story 7. The Wraith of Dread. The village of Ravenshade had long been cursed, a place where the fog never lifted, where the air was thick with the scent of decay. They spoke in hushed tones of an ancient horror that lurked in the mist, a being of nightmares, its face twisted into a skeletal maw filled with jagged, rotten fangs. It was known as the Wraith of Dread. They said it did not hunger for flesh. It hungered for fear. Christopher Hale, a historian obsessed with forbidden legends, arrived in Ravenshade with the arrogance of a man who did not believe in ghosts. He scoffed at the warnings, at the way the villagers averted their eyes when he asked about the Wraith. He dismissed the stories of those who had ventured into the mist and never returned, calling them old wives' tales. "There is no such thing as a curse," he muttered to himself as he ventured into the fog-cloaked woods with his lantern and notebook. But the silence was wrong. There were no birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves. The forest was dead. And then, the whispering began. Soft at first, like the wind brushing against hollow bones. But soon, it grew into something else, chilling voices, murmuring in a language older than time itself. The mist thickened, curling around Christopher like grasping fingers. Then he saw it. A shape emerging from the fog. Tall, hollow. Watching. The Wraith's face was a decayed skull stretched with sinew, its teeth impossibly long, glistening with rot. Its eyes were voids, black pits that reflected nothing but the fear it devoured. It did not move. It did not breathe. It simply waited. Christopher tried to run, but the mist dragged at his legs like unseen hands. The whispering turned into screams, voices shrieking in agony, crying out names, his name. He stumbled, falling to his knees, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The Wraith drifted closer, its tattered form moving as if the shadows themselves carried it forward. "Christopher," the voices called. His own voice joined them. He had not yet screamed, but he could hear himself screaming within the mist, trapped within the whispers, his terror already claimed. The Wraith loomed over him, its skeletal grin widening. And then, as the darkness swallowed him whole, Christopher understood the terrible truth. The Wraith did not simply kill its victims. It absorbed them, their souls forever screaming in the fog, warning those who would not listen. Christopher Hale was never seen again, but the fog in Ravenshade grew thicker that night, and the whispering never stopped. But the nightmare did not end there. Days later, villagers began seeing shadows in the mist, figures moving just beyond their vision, whispering their names. The Wraith had been fed, but it was not sated. It was growing. Those who had spoken to Christopher before his disappearance were the first to vanish. One by one, the innkeeper, the butcher, and even the village elder were swallowed by the fog, their screams barely lasting a second before silence reclaimed them. The town's fear deepened, and the people locked themselves indoors long before dusk, hoping their prayers would keep the Wraith at bay. But prayers did not matter here. One night, a desperate man, Richard Grayson, a former hunter, decided to put an end to the terror. Armed with a rifle, lantern, and a bag of salt, old folk remedies whispered among the elders, he ventured into the fog. He did not return. In his place, the villagers found his lantern still burning at the edge of the woods, casting flickering shadows that did not belong to anything living. The whispers grew louder. Soon, Ravenshade was no more. Those who did not flee were taken, their names added to the eternal chorus in the mist. The land itself became cursed, claimed by something older than time, something that did not belong in this world. A traveler, unaware of the village's fate, arrived months later, only to find nothing but emptiness where Ravenshade had once stood. The houses were still there, untouched, as if frozen in time. But there were no people, no voices, only the suffocating, unnatural fog, watching, waiting. The traveler's journal, discovered years later, bore the last words written in shaking script. The mist is alive. I hear them calling my name. The wraith is still here. It always was. It knows I can hear it. The journal ended abruptly. The traveler was never found, and the whispering never ceased. Story 8. The Drowned Horror. The town of Blackwater was a place swallowed by its own sins. Built on the edge of a vast and endless swamp, it had been a refuge for criminals, drifters, and those looking to escape the laws of man. But there were older laws, forgotten ones, that the swamp never forgave. For centuries, the people of Blackwater whispered about the drowned one. They said she had once been a woman, a victim of the town's cruelty, left to sink beneath the fetid waters. But she did not die, not truly. Instead, the swamp claimed her, remade her, filled her with vengeance. And now, whenever the rain fell hardest and the waters rose, she came back, crawling from the depths, searching for those who had wronged her. Ethan Caldwell had never believed in such things. He was a journalist, sent to Blackwater to investigate the string of disappearances that had plagued the town for decades. The locals would not speak to him, their faces full of fear, their doors locking the moment the rain began to fall. On his third night in town, the storm came. Lightning slashed the sky, illuminating the swamp in brief, blinding flashes. The air reeked of rot and something far fouler, something like decay. Ethan, undeterred by the warnings, set out with his camera, determined to document whatever was lurking in the mire. The whispers started as soon as he stepped off the main road. They came from the water, from the trees, from the very air itself. Gurgling, wet, ancient. His breath caught in his throat as something moved in the water, rippling the surface, dragging itself forward with slow, deliberate purpose. Then he saw her, a grotesque figure, pale and swollen with rot, emerged from the murky depths. Her flesh sagged, slick with water and peeling in places to reveal blackened bone beneath. Hollow, glowing eyes locked onto his, and a mouth filled with jagged, unnatural teeth grinned. Ethan stumbled back, his foot sinking into the mud, but the creature lurched forward. A scream bubbled in his throat as she reached for him, her elongated fingers curling around his ankle, her grip impossibly strong. He kicked, fought, clawed at the earth, but she was pulling him down, dragging him toward the water, toward the darkness beneath. As his head went under, he saw them. Dozens of others. Faces trapped beneath the surface, their mouths forever open in silent screams, their eyes wide with eternal terror. The swamp had swallowed them all, made them part of her, and now it would take him too. The last thing he saw before the murky blackness took him was her face, inches from his, her smile widening. By morning, the rain had stopped. Ethan Caldwell was never seen again. The town did not mourn him. The people of Blackwater had seen too many disappear into the swamp to waste grief on another stranger. They simply went on, as they always had, keeping their heads down, their doors locked, their voices low when the storms came. But something was different. The swamp had always been hungry, but now it was restless. The rains came heavier, the fog thicker, and the whispers no longer waited for nightfall. They seeped through the walls of homes, curled through the streets like unseen tendrils. The people tried to ignore them, tried to pretend they did not hear their names being called from the water. And then the drownings began. Not the disappearances, not the silent vanishings in the dead of night. This was different. This was violent. The first was a fisherman found floating in the shallows, his face twisted in horror, his hands clawing at his own throat. Then came the mayor's wife, discovered in her bathtub, her skin waterlogged as though she had been submerged for days, though she had only been missing a few hours. The town turned on itself. Some fled, but the roads had become treacherous, the waters rising to swallow those who tried to escape. Some barricaded themselves inside their homes, but the whispers slithered in, relentless, patient. A preacher took up his Bible and declared that the town must be cleansed, that the sins of their ancestors had cursed them all. He led a group into the swamp, torches in hand, chanting prayers meant to banish the evil. They were never seen again. But the next day, the swamp was filled with bodies. They hung from the trees, their bloated forms swaying in the wind, their eyes black pits of emptiness. And among them, she stood, watching, smiling. The drowned one had not just come for vengeance. She had come to claim Blackwater. The town no longer exists. Travelers who pass through where it once stood find only ruins, crumbling buildings overtaken by vines, streets choked with mud. No signs of life remain, but the air is thick with the scent of rot, and the ground is always damp, no matter the season. Some say if you stand at the water's edge, you can still hear them. The voices of the lost, whispering from the depths, calling for help that will never come. And if you stare too long into the murky blackness, you might see a pair of glowing eyes staring back. Story 9. Demon in the Darkness. Since ancient times, when humanity was still shrouded in the shadows of superstition and fear, people had whispered about a creature that did not belong to this world. A demon with massive horns, bat-like wings as dark as the abyss, and eyes that burned like two fiery pits. It had no name, no mercy, only endless cruelty. In a remote village hidden deep within the cursed forest, where no one dared to step foot after sunset, there existed a forbidden legend. It was the story of the Hell Gate, a place where an ancient demon had been sealed away. Rumor had it that every 100 years, the seal weakened, and all it took was a fool reckless enough to set the beast free. And this time, that fool was Jack Holloway, a man obsessed with the pursuit of immortality. Jack had heard of the legend since he was a child, but while the villagers avoided it like a plague, he was consumed by it. The ancient tomes he found in his father's underground library spoke of a dark ritual that could open the gate and summon the imprisoned demon. In return, he would receive boundless power. On a moonless night, Jack stood in the middle of the forest, clutching a ceremonial dagger engraved with archaic symbols. He carved a circle of blood into the ground, chanting incantations in a language not meant for human tongues. The sky darkened instantly, an icy wind howling as if death itself had arrived. The earth trembled. A voice rumbled from beneath, deep and sinister. "Do you know what you have just done?" Jack swallowed hard but did not waver. "I summon you. Grant me power." A chilling laughter echoed, sharp and grating like claws scraping against stone. The gate before him slowly creaked open, and from the darkness, a grotesque figure emerged. He had arrived. Jack felt his breath sucked from his lungs as he gazed upon the demon. Wrinkled, leathery skin stretched over protruding bones, and eyes like burning coals stared deep into him. "You seek power?" Jack nodded, unable to speak. The demon stepped out of the gate, its claws scraping against the ground, leaving behind scorched marks. It raised a skeletal hand and touched Jack's forehead. Instantly, searing pain erupted through his body. He screamed, feeling as if his very flesh was being torn apart. But then, as the agony subsided, he sensed an overwhelming power coursing through his veins. Yet he failed to realize, at that moment, He had lost his soul. In the days that followed, Jack noticed his body beginning to change. At first, it was merely horrific nightmares every night. But then, his skin darkened, his fingernails lengthened into claws, and every time he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw himself, only the glowing red eyes of a demon. He could no longer control himself. The hunger gnawed at him endlessly, but normal food no longer satisfied him. He needed something else. He needed blood. And that night, the village witnessed unspeakable horror. Screams shattered the silence of the dark as Jack, or rather the monster he had become, tore through every living soul in the village. Blood splattered in all directions, the sound of bones snapping like a symphony of death. He was no longer human, but a demon thirsting for slaughter. Those who survived hid in their homes, covering their mouths to suppress their terror. But they did not know. He could smell their fear. By dawn, the village was lifeless. Jack stood among the carnage, blood dripping from his hands. But then, from the shadows, a familiar voice called out, "Did you think I would grant you power without a price?" The demon stepped forth from the darkness, a wicked grin stretching across its face. "Now, it is time for you to return to me." Jack tried to run, but his legs were no longer his own. From the ground, blackened hands shot up, clawing at him, dragging him down. He screamed, struggling to escape, but it was useless. As he was pulled into the abyss, the gate slammed shut. And from that day forward, no one ever heard the name Jack Holloway again. Yet every 100 years, when the night becomes unnaturally silent and the wind howls with agonized wails, people say they still hear his voice echoing from the darkness, pleading for release from his eternal torment in hell. But no one can save him. No one can escape the price of the demon. Story 10. The Black Witch. Deep within a cursed forest, where sunlight never reached, stood an ancient wooden shack hidden in thick, rolling fog. The villagers called it the Devil's Lair, a place no soul had ever entered and returned from alive. Legend spoke of a witch, a creature no longer human, who dwelled within its rotting walls. Once she had been mortal, but her insatiable thirst for power had led her down a forbidden path. Through unspeakable rituals, she had bartered her soul for eternal magic. But the price was gruesome. Her flesh withered, leaving behind only a grotesque skull. Her body became a twisted shadow, and only her eerie laughter echoed through the night winds. Each blood moon, the villagers heard her mournful wails drifting from the forest. Those who wandered too close never returned. Only pools of blackened blood remained where they had last stood. One fateful evening, an American traveler named John Holloway arrived in town. He was a skeptical man, drawn not by fear but by curiosity. He had heard whispers of the Black Witch during his travels and dismissed them as mere folklore. But something about the villagers' terrified eyes intrigued him. He decided to uncover the truth. The journey into the woods. With only a lantern and a hunting knife, John ventured into the cursed woods. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, seeping into his bones like icy death. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. An unnatural silence swallowed the sounds of the night, as if the world itself feared what lay ahead. The farther he walked, the heavier the air became. He noticed strange symbols carved into tree trunks, each one more intricate and ancient than the last. At one point, he stumbled upon what looked like an old altar covered in dried blood. The sight sent a chill through his spine, but he pressed forward, determined to prove the legend false. The shack in the mist. The shack loomed before him, its wooden planks rotting with age, the doorway gaping like the maw of a starving beast. Inside, a massive cauldron bubbled at the center of the room, its contents glowing an unnatural molten red. A putrid stench of decay thickened the air. A low, rattling cackle shattered the silence. From the shadows, the Black Witch emerged. "You have come at the perfect time. I was just missing some fresh ingredients." Before John could react, an inky black mist poured from the cauldron, coiling around him like living tendrils. He gasped, struggling against the suffocating darkness. His skin prickled as an unbearable heat consumed him. He screamed as his flesh began to boil, his veins turning to fire. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw was the witch's hollow, soulless eyes watching in delight. The witch's curse. As his body was consumed by darkness, John suddenly found himself standing in a vast, endless void. The air was thick with whispers, voices of those who had come before him, warning him of his fate. The witch had not merely killed him, she had trapped him in an eternal nightmare. He felt his body twist and morph, his very essence merging with the shadows. He was no longer himself. He was part of the darkness now, another voice added to the chorus of tormented souls. The witch stirred her cauldron, her grin widening as the last traces of John's existence were absorbed into her brew. The cycle had continued, just as it had for centuries. His soul, like the others, was now bound to her forever. The endless horror. As the night waned, the cauldron bubbled once more, its fresh brew ready. Somewhere in the distant village, another fool would soon hear the legend and dare to challenge it, unaware of the true horror awaiting them. And so, the legend of the Black Witch endured, whispered in hushed voices among those who feared what lurked in the dark. But the foolish, the greedy, the unbelievers, they would always come. And she would always be waiting.